Hello and welcome to this week's episode of BariAftercare, the podcast. Again, we're picking up right where we left off last week. This is the third and final week. We're going to be talking about intuitive eating, unless you guys have other ideas about that and want more information about it. Last week, we started to outline the book, The 10 Principles of Intuitive Eating, a detailed description, and today is part 2 of that discussion. And just as a reminder, all of the information, other than my commentary, is coming from a book called Intuitive Eating, a Revolutionary Anti-Diet Approach by Evelyn, Tribole, and Elyse Resch, 4th edition. So if you're interested in reading that book, the contact information, I guess there's not contact information for a book, but there will be a link to the book on Amazon. So you can check out that book if it's something you're interested in. And last week we talked about basically what intuitive eating, according to these authors, is. And we started talking about the first 2 principles. So we didn't get very far considering there are 10, but they were really, really in depth, and I thought they were really, really important principles. So if you missed that episode, go on back, take a listen. And the episode before that, by the way, this is episode 200, which makes me so excited because that means, let's see, there are 52 weeks in a year. So that means I have, and those who have done this podcast with me have been doing this for over 2 years. I love that. And even more, I love that you are listening to the podcast. Bariatric information, and bariatric is a term that just means the science of dealing with obesity. So bariatric information typically focuses on nutrition and exercise, the behavior modification in relation to diet and exercise. But as you and I know, there is a whole lot more to the science of bariatric medicine, which has to do with the emotional, the psychological components. That's what BariAftercare, the podcast, is all about. So if you know anybody who struggles with the disease of obesity, whether or not they are choosing to have weight loss surgery or any surgical procedure related to their obesity, encourage them to listen to this podcast. And honestly, most of the information fits for anybody in the world, so there you have that. But we're going to continue with our discussion about intuitive eating today and focusing on the 10 principles from this book. So we talked about the first 2 principles, the first of which was diet mentality. Get rid of it. Reject the diet mentality. I absolutely 100% endorse this principle. Diet mentality causes more problems for people than we can even begin to imagine. And in this book, they lay out a lot of research that supports that notion. So rejecting the diet mentality works for anybody who is really serious about losing weight and doing it in a really healthy way. The second principle that we talked about is honor your hunger. Now, this can be tricky for persons who have had weight loss surgery. And it can be tricky for people who have dieted time and time again over the years because you can lose touch with that sense of hunger, the physiological sense of hunger. And if you remember, and as a recap, how these authors define the 3 features of intuitive eating is unconditional permission to eat when you're hungry and to eat whatever food is desired. The second feature of intuitive eating is eating for physical rather than emotional eating or emotional reasons. I like that. And thirdly, reliance on internal hunger and satiety, satisfaction cues to determine when and how much to eat. Now that can be a problem for chronic dieters or for people who have emotionally tuned out from their physiological feelings of hunger or fullness, and it can be a problem for those who have had a surgical procedure on their stomach and or their intestines, because some of that physiological feeling is lost when you have bariatric surgery of any kind. So sometimes that third principle of, or not principle, but feature of intuitive eating is not going to fit for people who have either emotionally or psychologically lost touch, or for whatever physiological reason, they don't get the appropriate hunger or satiety cues. So we are going to talk more about the benefits of intuitive eating for anybody and the limitations possibly given the fact that you may have a biological or have had a surgery that interferes with those procedures. So onward and forward. I want to start with principle 3 because we've already talked about principles 1 and 2, which again were rejecting the diet mentality and honoring your hunger. All right, onward and forward. Again, I'm working from the book titled, what is that title again? Intuitive Eating, a Revolutionary Anti-Diet Approach by Evelyn Tribole and Elyse, Resch, 4th edition. So the third principle that they mention in their book is the principle of making peace with food. I like this concept. Let's see what they mean by it, and let's see if it fits for everyone across the board, or if you're someone who's had a surgical procedure, if you might want to give this some thought. All right. In the book, they say if you tell yourself that you can't or shouldn't have a particular food, it can lead to intense feelings of deprivation, for sure. Absolutely agree with that. And this deprivation that can build into uncontrollable cravings and oftentimes binging. I think that's a fair statement. I think that people who have experienced this not having a peaceful relationship with food and taking foods completely off limits, unless, of course, as I always say, there's an addiction issue, which we will talk about in and out of this discussion. So unless there's an addiction issue with a particular food or a particular food groups, then any food ought to be on your list of options. They're saying when you restrict a certain food or a particular food group, then you're setting yourself up for those feelings of deprivation, cravings, and overindulgence. Probably true. As they point out in the book, cravings run rampant as soon as we're restricted from any kind of substance. That may be general, that may fit for you, that may not fit for you, but that's what they're saying. And they're saying that the natural reaction that's triggered by limitation and deprivation often is cravings and often can lead to overeating. I don't disagree with that. I think many people, many of you have experienced that, and I've probably experienced that as well. In fact, they say being restricted from anything in life sets it up to be extra special, regardless of age. Well, I suppose there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, if you think especially about teenagers, don't take those car keys, or, don't you be drinking before you're of age. But they're saying that, of any age, it's probably a true statement. I don't know. I think some of it has to do with the wording here, being restricted from. So if somebody's telling you can't have that, then maybe it triggers those, thoughts of it being something extra special, or definitely gotta have it. I restrict alcohol from my life. There is nobody, however, telling me I have to restrict it. That may be a difference. For me, I choose to restrict alcohol from my life because of the consequences it sets in motion in my life, because I do have an addiction to that particular chemical, those particular chemical combinations, whatever. Alcohol for me leads to problems. So nobody's told me I can't have it. I choose to restrict it myself. And therein may be a difference. One of the things that I like in here is that they talk about what a powerful experience deprivation can be, both biologically and psychologically. And they talk about a psychologist named Fritz Heider, who states that depriving yourself of something you want can actually heighten your desire for that very item. The moment you banish a food, and I'm quoting, it paradoxically builds up a craving life of its own that gets stronger with each diet and builds more momentum as the deprivation deepens. And I think this is true for many people who have been on diets, one right after the other, or periodically over many years. It's like, oh gosh, I'm going to do the diet thing again. And on every diet, this particular food is not allowed. So here I go. Now I'm going to be thinking about that food more and more. So I think there's a lot of validity to this. And I think that there's some psychological power that may come from feeling as though someone's restricting you from it or someone's telling you you can't have it versus, as I said a minute ago, choosing that that is not something you want to engage with. Again, back to the book. If you're someone who's experienced deprivation in areas outside of food, this is interesting, such as love, attention, material things, and so on. So if you've been deprived in your life because maybe you were in a lower socioeconomic class, or maybe because your parents had rigid adherence to something for religious purposes, or maybe they just thought that, for example, an iPhone is really a horrible thing for a child, but all the other teens have it, and so you're feeling deprived. So if you're deprived, whether it's in things or people withheld love from you, maybe grandparents or your parents or people that you're in relationships with, or if you're denied attention or anything that you're denied, you're deprived of, here's what they're saying. The deprivation connected to dieting may feel even more intense for you. So think about that. If you've been deprived of other things, there may be a connection for you where if you go on a diet, you feel the deprivation even more strongly than people who got those other needs met. I think that's really interesting. So I hadn't heard that before, hadn't given it much thought, but I think it's something worth considering. So maybe you feel deprivation more strongly from food than other people do if you've been deprived in other areas of your life. The authors also say that each impending diet, each new time you pick up a new diet or go on a new craze or a new fad, it brings more fear of deprivation with that knowledge that you're not going to get enough or get any of what you want. And then comes the more overeating, and then comes the loss of self-control, and then comes that erosion of self-esteem. So we've got that vicious cycle of deprivation, craving, overeating, guilt. It's almost like an abuse cycle. It can be compared to that, and I think so fairly. And we are causing that and bringing it on ourselves. So in a way, these are not their words, these are my words. But when you engage in deprivation, again, unless there's an addiction issue or you're making a choice, not somebody's telling you you can't have something, then maybe you're setting yourself up for a cycle of abuse within yourself. Now they talk about some different kinds of rebound kinds of eating. Sometimes they'll say, like, people will have a food competition. And I heard a really great anecdote to this the other day. But food competition is like when you're a kid, if you have siblings and you've got to split up the candy bar or the piece of cake, you're going to cut yourself a bigger slice, or people are going to be fighting over the bigger slice. Well, I had some friends here a couple of weeks ago, and my friend was talking about in her family, one person had to cut it, the other person got to choose which piece they wanted. I thought, ooh, that's going to result in a more equal sharing or equal slicing of that food. But sometimes there are food competitions, and you dig in because you fear you're not going to get as much as other people, and that may lead to overeating in a case. I think that made some sense. Another thing they refer to is called what they call the returning home syndrome. So when people return from having been away from something like a food, so you're on a diet, you're depriving yourself, and then you return home, you get off the diet, and you go back to those old habits, right? Maybe one of those old habits was eating this particular food that was restricted, and now you've got the welcome back home, and you overindulge. So they refer to that as a returning home syndrome. And they write, any food will take on heightened allure when one is returning from a journey in which it wasn't available. And that's kind of true when you go out of the country or you go camping or whatever and you don't have all the comforts of home. It's like, oh, I'm so glad to have this again. Makes some sense. Now here's one that's a little iffy for me when it comes to following a healthy bariatric lifestyle. You decide for yourself. But they refer to this as the empty cupboard. They say if there's consistently not a particular food in your house, then you're going to want that food more and more and more. So I don't know about this because to me, I believe, and I encourage people who have had a surgical procedure to keep their home a safe zone, free from unnecessary temptation. Because I think if it's there and you don't have a good handle on your emotional relationship with food, or you don't have a good sense of your hunger or satiety physiological symptoms, or you have a history of unhealthy habits of eating out of boredom or eating mindlessly, it's too easy to go to those foods. So I encourage people who are post-op and for the rest of your life that you need to set up an environment for safety. And I liken it to when you have young children, you need to have a safe environment for your kids. If you've got stairs and you've got toddlers, you need to have gates at the bottom of them or at the top of them so they can't climb up and fall down. So it's a safety thing in my mind, but I'd be curious to know your thoughts on that. I recommend having empty cupboards when it comes to certain foods for post-ops. Also, they talk about a once-in-a-lifetime situation. So if you're traveling out of the country and you may give yourself permission to eat things that you normally wouldn't, I don't know that if that's a horrible thing. Again, unless you have no off switch. For example, my husband and I were in Italy a couple years ago, and we were at one of those adorable outdoor Italian restaurants, and the owner of the place came and put 2 shots of alcohol in front of us. Well, neither one of us drink. My husband doesn't have the addiction issue I have, but he just chooses not to drink. And so we said, no, thank you. And they got very, very offended. But just because I'm in this wonderfully romantic and aesthetically pleasing situation and it's not in my home and it's, oh my gosh, this is a once-in-a-lifetime trip, I'm not going to potentially throw away my sobriety and set myself up on a course for disaster because the shop owner is going to be offended. And you have to make up your mind whether you're going to allow grandma to, and her, oh my gosh, I'm going to be offended if you don't eat all 7 of my desserts at Halloween time or Thanksgiving time or Christmas time or whatever it happens to be. And again, if you are not struggling with an addiction, then maybe it's okay to enjoy those once-in-a-lifetime kinds of things. And so I agree with that. So back to the book. They say chronic dieters adapt by changing both their mindset and their responsiveness to their inner body cues. This adaptation is known as restrained eating. So let's talk about what they mean by this restrained eating. They say it's chronic dieters, you've dieted, who are preoccupied with dieting and weight control. And this kind of goes back to that first one. Get rid of the diet mentality. Get rid of the diet mentality. I think that is really, really wise, because when you're in that diet mentality, or you're a restrained eater, as they're describing here, when you break a rule, it's like, forget it, it's over. You know, I give in, and they refer to it as what the hell effect. You know, it's like, what the hell, I blew it, I might as well give in. And that is not a healthy way to live your life. That's that all or nothing, which is not a healthy way of living your life. So you don't want to fall into that. So I agree with that. And they give a lot of studies about this kind of restrained eating and how it can go way awry. They also talk about the seesaw syndrome, which they call guilt versus deprivation. So they say the more deprived you become from a food, the greater the deprivation backlash, and they call it the seesaw effect. So when it comes to dieting, you have these huge feelings of deprivation. Oh my God, I feel so deprived. I feel so deprived. And then you've got guilt, because if I give in, now I've given into the deprivation, but I have all this guilt, neither one being a good thing. And so I do agree with that. I don't think food should be off limits if you can do moderation. If you can't do moderation, or if you have an addiction, I think it's a wise choice to choose not to have that for yourself. And maybe it's just at the beginning of your journey, or maybe it's until you get this emotional eating, if that's a thing for you, under control. So they say the key is unconditional permission to eat, which of course makes me clutch my pearls. Unconditional permission to eat. The key to abolishing the pattern of restraint and rebound eating is to give yourself unconditional permission to eat. Now, you and I know this can go very, very awry. If some people give themselves unconditional permission to eat anything they want, they're going to go off the rails. But again, you have to go back to their definition and their tenets of intuitive eating, which says permission to eat what you want when you're hungry, not just any old time, and to only eat to the point where you're satisfied, not stuffed. But these things have to be learned. And if you're not at that place where you're capable of that yet, you might want to wait until you've had some therapy or some help in getting to the place where you can actually live this way without sabotaging yourself. So in order to do this, they say you got to throw out that notion of good foods and bad foods, and eating what you really want without the guilt. Now, again, you've got to be in a pretty good headspace to be able to do that. So if your relationship with food is not healthy at this point, I would work your way toward this as a goal, rather than going, woohoo, I'm going to be an emotion or an intuitive eater, and I'm going to eat whatever I want. That may not work for you right off the bat. But if you can do it, then go for it. They say legalizing food is a critical step in changing your relationship with food. Again, for most people, I would agree with that. Given you have no addiction, and given you currently have the emotional capability to stop when you're full. We'll see. All right, we're going to go on, and we're going to talk about a lack of self-trust. And here's where this becomes difficult, this giving yourself permission to eat whatever you want, whenever you want. Because as they say in their words, a mighty obstacle to making peace with food is a strong lack of self-trust. And because I've worked in this field for so long, and because I've listened to patients for so long, I hear over and over and over that there is a lack of self-trust. So they're saying this is going to work if you have self-trust. And I am also saying the same thing. In other words, if you don't trust yourself to do this yet, then don't do it yet. A lack of self-trust is going to sabotage this. So you have to work toward developing that trust in yourself. So that is maybe something you need to work toward. A psychologist named Erik Erikson, he's a psychoanalyst. He's a pioneer in human development. Really great. He's done great work. He says, don't underestimate the profound impact that self-trust can have. He explains that as people go through a series of psychosocial stages throughout their life, and I believe this, it's like, you've got infants, and then you've got toddlers, and then you've got preschoolers, and then you've got school-age children, then you've got teenagers, then you've got adolescents, and you've got young adults and older adults, right? And at each stage of our development as humans, we have different developmental needs, and we have different, what he refers to as tasks to overcome. And the task of self-trust is one that happens in an early stage of development. And if your parents don't allow you choices at this time of your life, you don't learn to develop that self-trust. So if you're not given any choices about what to eat, or if you're not given the choice to brush your teeth before the bedtime story or after the bedtime story, you don't learn to make healthy decisions. So this is something that can be a critical thing you need to learn to develop before you can try out this intuitive eating method and be successful at it. Because if you've been given the message you can't be trusted around food, because maybe a parent made all of your food decisions for you, or maybe they severely restricted something and now you can't trust yourself to say no or to stop, then this is an issue. And it would make intuitive eating contraindicated, not a good idea for you, until you learn this very important skill. And the good news about these developmental tasks is if you miss them along the way, according to Erikson, you can go back and resolve these things at any time in life. And I agree with that. But you're probably not going to do it on your own. You're probably going to need some help doing that. All right. So that is the third principle of the intuitive eating. The fourth one is challenging the food police. Now, we all know about food police. So most of the time we think of food police as external to ourselves, but the food police can be very internal, right? Because over your years of dieting, you've developed all these, these shoulds and these oughts and can'ts and musts and must nots. So you have the internal dialogue that produces a lot of guilt. So you have a lot of food police inside of yourself, not to mention those outside of yourself. But the authors say that chasing the food police away is a critical step in returning to intuitive eating. And they have found, what they say is they found that regardless of the level of inappropriate comments from the collective food police, whether it's inside your head or coming from other people, the one inside yourself, they say, the inner food police that resides in the minds of our clients is the harshest. I absolutely believe this to be true. I also believe that the most harsh self-talk or the most harsh criticism about us in general, whether it's how we look, about our abilities, about our likability, comes from us. It may have come externally from the kids at school or from the coaches or from the parents or the siblings or the cousins earlier in life. But as adults, we do more damage to ourselves than anybody else does. I absolutely believe that. So they define the food police as that strong voice that's developed through your dieting experiences and through diet culture. It's that inner judge. It's the one that says this is a good food or a bad food, or what you see in magazines and what you see in other people doing. And here are some of the common rules that the food police have. Don't eat at night. Better not eat that bagel. There's too many carbs. What, the carb police. You didn't exercise today, so you better not eat dinner. It's not time to eat yet. Now, that food police, if you are a post-op patient, you are encouraged to eat on a schedule. Again, that's why some of the intuitive eating pieces may be appropriate for you, while others really may not be. Because you want to make sure you're eating on a regular schedule when you have a small pouch of a stomach, because you have to have enough energy to keep you going, and you have to have the right nutrition to keep you going. So again, there's a little bit of, is this the right thing for a post-op? Not too much, or not necessarily all the time. So that food police, you're going to have to fight that regardless of whether you're trying to be an intuitive eater or you're just learning to develop a healthy relationship with food, which is part of the intuitive eating school of thought, right? Developing that healthy relationship with food. They talk about, in conjunction with the food police, the diet rebel, right? And that diet rebel is very loud. Don't tell me what to do, right? You tell me not to eat that, you watch me. Let's see how many cookies I can stuff in before mom gets home. This is in the book. You're not going to tell me I have to eat that plain old boiled chicken. I can't wait till my partner, that outside food police, goes out of town so I can eat whatever I want without them chastising me. So those are all really, really good examples of a negative food police. But here's how they say you can switch that food police around to being an ally, to having a rebel ally that can help you use words instead of acting out with food. And what they do is, again, it's setting boundaries with people. It's using communication skills, asking family members not to comment on the food choices you make, telling your family and friends and people on the streets not to make comments about your diet. Now, this can be really tough too, and this is a psychological, emotional piece that goes along with any unhealthy relationship with food or unhealthy relationship with yourself. A lot of times we struggle to set boundaries with people. We don't want to rock the boat. We don't like conflict. We don't want to make anybody unhappy. You have to learn to do those things, which have nothing to do with being an intuitive eater or not. It has to do with learning to be a healthy adult. So those skills have to come from somewhere else, and usually it has to come from somebody who is trained to help you do that, a coach or a therapist. So the intuitive eater, they say, speaks your gut reactions. So they're like, but I'm not hungry right now, so don't ask me to eat that. Again, that's not going to work as a post-op, because you need to eat on a schedule. But the intuitive eater, their voice may say some things like this. This is in the book, that rumble in my stomach means I'm hungry, I need to eat. They ask, what do I feel like eating for dinner tonight? What sounds good to me? It feels so good to be out of that dieting prison. And intuitive eating encourages these statements, and so do I, because it tells you about your gut reactions. And if you eat for satisfaction, then that can diminish the cravings. And we'll talk more about that, because you can incorporate that into your post-op life for sure. You can eat things that you enjoy and that you want, provided you follow the bariatric process, which is eating the protein first. I'm going to wait till I get to that part. In this same chapter and this same principle, they talk about self-talk. They call it a special arsenal for challenging the food police. And this is what I meant a few minutes ago when I said we're harsher with ourselves pretty much than anybody else is. They say negative self-talk often makes us feel despair. The feeling of despair, why bother? The what the hell attitude, right? Often triggers sabotaging behaviors. And this is something that is really critical to change. If you've got a really lifelong habit of being criticized and have taken that on as something you do to yourself on a regular basis, you've got to get help with this. Because until you stop self-sabotaging with your words to yourself, it's going to be almost impossible to develop that healthy relationship with food. Because when you don't like yourself, when you're constantly berating yourself, when you're calling yourself names, when you're engaging in this pounding of yourself emotionally through your self-talk, you're not going to treat yourself well. You are going to feel defeated and you are going to say, why bother? You have to have what they refer to in the book as compassionate self-awareness. I love that. We do need to have compassionate self-awareness, which they refer to as the ultimate weapon against the food police. And I agree, it's also a wonderful weapon against negative self-talk, because we have to be able to say, okay, I just called myself a negative name again. That's not going to help me. But I have compassion because I learned that over a series of years and a period of time. It's going to take me time to change that. Another good reason I recommend the book, Learning to Heal Emotional Eating for Trauma Survivors. Excellent book. Many, many podcast episodes about it. But it's all about that compassion towards yourself to get away from that harsh self-talk. Moving on, Principle 5, discover the satisfaction factor. And this is, we're going to talk about eating what you want, what's going to satisfy you in the moment. So this can work even if you've had weight loss surgery. So let's find out how. But the authors say when you eat what you really want in an environment that is inviting, the pleasure you derive will be a powerful force in helping you feel satisfied and content. And I agree with that. They go on to say that Abraham Maslow, the hierarchy of needs, right, has taught us that we are driven by our unmet needs. We want what we can't have, and we'll do whatever it takes to calm down the sense of deprivation that arises when our needs are not satisfied. This is a whole podcast episode, and believe you me, I'm going there soon. But when we have a need for love or belonging, if you know those people, men and women, boys and girls who have looked for love in all the wrong places, it's because they don't know how to get that need for love met in a healthy way because they weren't taught it. So they're going sleeping around, which is not who they want to be, but that need, that unmet need for acceptance and being wanted and being approved of is so strong. We are driven by our unmet needs. So if you have deprivation going on, again, unless you're an addict, you need to enjoy what you're eating. And they're talking about you need to find foods that's going to hit the spot. So when you're on a diet and you want some pasta and it's forbidden, and that's by God what would hit the spot, how can you incorporate that so you're not left with that yearning or that desire or that craving that's going to make you want it more and more and start those cravings? You can do this as a post-op, all right? You can allow yourself, as they say in the book, the pleasure and satisfaction for most eating experiences, and you'll be content. I totally believe that. So how do you do that as a post-op? They say the first step is ask yourself what you really want. What do I really want? Well, you know what? I want thick crust pizza. Or I really, really want, something sweet and gooey. Or I really, really want, pasta would just hit the spot right now. Or rice. Oh my gosh, rice would just hit the spot right now. You can do that as a post-op and get that satisfaction. Here's how you do that. So you eat the protein first, right? Eat your serving of protein first. Because as a post-op, you want to get that need for protein in. It will fill you, keep you fuller longer. It will not put weight on you. Then you make sure you have your fruits and your veggies, and then give yourself the thing that's going to hit the spot. Because if you've already eaten the other things, that pouch of yours is not going to be able to take in this much rice, plate full of rice, as opposed to an eighth of a cup. You'll still get that, oh my gosh, I'm so glad I had that rice. Or you could have a fourth of a cup of pasta after you've had your protein and gotten all your nutritional foods in. Then you can have that pasta and go, wow, that was a really satisfying meal. So you do not have to deprive yourself if you can eat those things and then let it go. If you fill the whole pouch up with pasta or white rice that has very little nutritional value, or the sweet and gooey, or the thick crust on the pizza that has no nutritional value, you're kind of defeating the purpose. So if this works for you as a post-op to get that, what will hit the spot in at the tail end of your meal, where you can just handle a little bit of it, then do it. If you can't, then don't. So it may be a trial and error thing. The authors of this book say, remember the 3 S's of satisfying eating. Eat slowly. And, there's a lot of talk in the bariatric community about mindful eating, which is eating slowly. Eat sensually. In other words, feel the texture, savor the flavor, enjoy the smell, enjoy the texture. So slowly, sensually, and savor every single bite. A lot of people, I'll eat with my brother-in-law when he's in town, and my God, he eats such a huge quantity of food in such a short period of time. I'm like, how could he have tasted any of that? So learning to eat slowly, eat sensually, and to savor is a really good way to eat. And as a post-op, if you want that food that's really going to hit the spot, then eat it at the end of your meal, which is eaten at a regularly scheduled time. So I love that. All right, the 6th principle is feel your fullness. Feel your fullness. Now this can be really difficult in those early on stages after bariatric surgery, and sometimes even later on. And a lot of people, I went to a program, a bariatric program last week, and I was listening to the dietitian, and she said something so profound that I wish everybody in the whole world who was a bariatric patient could hear this. And hopefully your dietitians are sharing this with you, because a lot of bariatric patients will say, I can tell when I'm full because my nose will run, or I'll hiccup, or I'll burp. And what this dietitian said that I think was so brilliant and is also part of intuitive eating is to eat until you're satisfied, not full. So being satisfied is going to come a bite or two before your nose starts to run as a post-op, before you're hiccuping or burping. Learning to eat to satisfaction, not fullness. I think that is really, really, really important. So, starting to learn to stop before you get to that point of being full. You don't want to get to the point of being stuffed. Intuitive eating means eating when you're hungry to the point of satisfaction, not stuffed, not painfully stuffed. My husband struggled with obesity as a teenager. And he said he would used to eat to the point where he was miserably stuffed. And that is not a happy place for most people to be. So you have to learn when you are satisfied, not stuffed. Now they talk about things like leaving food on the plate. That's difficult for a lot of people, especially if you were ordered as a child to eat everything on your plate. You know, the clean plate club. My husband has learned and is always very proud of himself when he leaves a few bites of food on the plate. You do what's right for you, but it's not about needing to eat everything on the plate. It's okay to eat everything on your plate if your eyes aren't bigger than your stomach, meaning you fill that plate with way too much food. It's about learning to respect your sense of being satisfied. That's what intuitive eating is all about, and I think that's a wonderful thing for anybody, including post-ops, right? So try to practice eating if you haven't had a bariatric procedure when you're satisfied. And what they say is ways to do that is to stop halfway at the end of the meal. You know, don't wait to the end of the meal. Stop midway and, you know, pay attention. Does this still taste good to me? And there's a lot of science behind you don't need that many bites of a food until that taste satisfaction wanes. So the first bite may taste amazing to you, and maybe the second and third bite, but after you've had several bites of things, you're not getting that flavor burst. So check to see, is this even still tasting good to me? And then check your satiety. Do I feel satisfied? Do I have hunger pains? And remember, sometimes we do have to slow this down because it does take time for the stomach and the brain to make that connection. I've had enough. So ask yourself in the middle of your meal, where's my satisfaction level at? And increase your awareness. And they say do this by all the things we promote as in bariatric. You know, eat without distraction. Pay attention. Again, savor the flavor. Slow yourself down. Make a conscious decision to, you know what? I'm going to make a conscious decision to stop right now because I'm guessing 2 or 3 bites, I'm going to have that runny nose or that burp or that, you know, that sign that I'm full, not just satisfied. And remember, they say in this book, and I love it, defend yourself from obligatory eating. No, Mom, I no longer have to eat everything on my plate. No, Grandma, it's okay for me to say no to certain things for the sake of my health. So learn to say no. And I know that's hard for people, and that falls into another category of learning to set boundaries for yourself, learning to use your vocal cords, and having the confidence in yourself and the belief that you're worthy enough to say no to other people. It's okay if they're upset or unhappy. All right, so beware of fullness. We don't want to get to full. And it says, be mindful of foods with staying power. And that's what I was talking about just a few minutes ago. It's like foods with staying power, especially for a post-op, are eating that protein first. Getting foods with some fiber. Eating the complex carbs versus the simple carbs. Making sure you have some healthy fats in there to increase that level of satiety. All right, so they talk in this book, they give some warnings. What if you can't stop eating, right? What if you figure out that you're a person who, it doesn't matter if I'm full or hungry, I keep eating? Well, they say this may be a sign that you're using food as a coping mechanism, which comes to the next principle. Principle 7, cope with your emotions with kindness. Cope with your emotions with kindness. Emotional eating is a big, big deal. If you're using food because you don't want to feel certain emotions like anger or frustration or sadness or loneliness, and food is what you do instead of feel that, then you have to learn to deal with your emotions. And that's not something you're going to do probably without a therapist or a mentor or a coach, because food is very comforting. Food can be love for a lot of people. Food can be a reward. Food can be a reliable friend. And sometimes it feels like it's your only friend. So this relationship with food, if it's based on intense emotions that you're trying to push away, sometimes in therapy, some therapists won't let you drink water. Don't swallow those emotions down. They won't let you chew gum. Don't swallow those emotions down. We want you to bring the emotion forward, which can be very, very difficult. So if you use food to squash emotions or to stay away from emotions that are unpleasant, then you've got to get some help externally. And even these authors say some of our clients are emotionally unaware. They have not yet learned to identify their feelings. This is true for a lot of people who have bariatric surgery, at least a lot of the patients that I have worked with in 20 years. So it may not even be obvious that you're using food as a coping mechanism. I teach this amazing class called Gain While You Lose, gain awareness of emotional eating, gain awareness of your relationship with food, gain awareness of your satiety as you lose an unhealthy relationship with food, as you lose pounds, as you lose negative thinking. It's a great class. Anyway, you have to become aware if you're an emotional eater. And if you are, then you need to learn from somebody how to deal with getting comfort in a healthy way, getting your anger out in a healthy way, expressing how you feel and not worrying about if it's going to upset anybody else. Because food can be sedating. It can be sedating like a drug. So, sometimes you get in that food coma. Some people use food to punish themselves. It's that abuse cycle, right? So if you have a lot of this eating going on that's not biologically induced, meaning I'm hungry, or if you're a post-op and you have that schedule and you find yourself eating in between, then you're grazing. That is not going to keep that weight off of you. As a post-op, you have a process that is important to follow. You don't skip meals. You don't eat in between meals. You eat that protein first. If you find yourself not doing that or struggling to do that, and you're eating whenever, whatever, and you're feeling a little bit out of control, or you're aware that there's emotions involved in this, then you need to get some help, probably from a therapist or a coach, a bariatric coach, or the dietitian who is familiar with bariatric lifestyle. So you have to learn to deal with emotional eating in healthy ways, and you have to learn things like, what am I feeling? What are my feelings telling me I need? How can I get these needs met in healthy ways? Because remember, what we learned earlier in this episode is that you're going to get your needs met because the unmet need is going to drive the bus. So if I'm feeling lonely, but the only way I know how to manage that is eating, until I learn a healthy way to deal with the loneliness, I will do what I know. So we've got these long-standing habits or learned behaviors, unhealthy coping skills, and you need to learn healthier coping skills. That is critical, and that is not in the protocol for a lot of bariatric programs. That's why I do what I do. That's why the BariAftercare program that you can sign up for is really geared toward teaching you healthy coping skills, how to deal with emotional eating. That Gain While You Lose class, which will soon be available by itself online so you can do it by yourself, but I teach it live twice a year, is such an important class. All right, the 8th principle is respect your body. Absolutely critical. And if you read the book, Healing Emotional Eating for Trauma Survivors, she talks about, she being Diane Petrella, who wrote the book, like the authors of this book, talk a lot about the fact that we need to learn to accept our bodies and accept that our bodies all have a different genetic blueprint. And how I explain it is, if we all ate the same thing for a solid year, did the same exercise for a solid year at the same time, and we're the same height, we wouldn't all weigh the same at the end of that year because we have different genetic blueprints. So we have to learn to accept and recognize and not be so critical of our own bodies. And having a negative body image is almost impossible not to do given our culture and the social media and the airbrushing and the filters and it's so important that we work on this. I don't know if any of us will ever come to the time in our lives where we say, oh yeah, buddy, I love my body. There's too much pressure in our society, for sure. If you're a person who can do that, God, more power to you, right? In Healing Emotional Eating for Trauma Survivors, she says, let's learn to, oh God, I can't remember the word she uses, but it's like, let's work with our body. And the word they use here is to have respect for your body. Not saying I love my body and everything about it, because that's probably not a true statement for most of us. But they say we're urging you to respect and appreciate the body you have today, which means taking care of your health. And they say, and that includes your mental health. And I love this. I love this. And then they give you ideas of how to respect your body. And they say, understand that body respect means my body deserves to be fed. I don't need to starve myself. I don't need to deprive myself. I deserve to treat my body with dignity. I deserve to feel comfortable in the way I dress and in the style I like. My body deserves to be touched affectionately with my consent and respect. My body deserves to move comfortably to the extent it is possible. This is beautiful. This is beautiful, just like it is in the book about healing emotional eating for trauma survivors. It's let's work with our bodies in a compassionate way. Oh, the Diane Petrella says, let's support our bodies. Let's support our bodies and feed it well. Let's support our bodies and move them. And in both books, they talk about doing nice things for your bodies. Get a massage. Take rest when you need it. View your body as an instrument, they say in this book, not an ornament. I love that, right? Our bodies are here to get us through this life. Let's work with them instead of harming them. And they talk about in this book, and I love this too, say goodbye to the fantasy, right? Say goodbye to the fantasy that I should have this weight on the scale. I should have the perfect proportions. The perfect proportions are different for different, generations. It used to be the Marilyn Monroe figure, then it was the Twiggy figure, then it was the Kim Kardashian figure. Now I hear that the Twiggy thing's coming back in. No. Let go of the fantasy and respect your genetic blueprint, because that's going to determine the shape of your body. All right, moving right along. Principle 9, movement. Feel the difference. In this chapter, I love it. They talk about don't exercise to lose calories. Exercise to feel better. Exercise to enjoy the energy that your body gets from it. Exercise to enjoy the mind enhancement. I don't mean drugs. I mean, like, wow, I like how I feel. I have more energy. I like the world and myself and other people better. They say you got to work through the exercise barriers, right? By focusing on how it feels. You feel more alert. You're able to handle stress better. You have a better general sense of well-being. You sleep better when you exercise. And they say decouple exercise from weight loss. Yeah, you may lose some weight by exercise, but that's not the point. The point is, if you focus on losing weight to exercise, you're going to lose motivation in a hurry. Movement is important for its own sake and for the many, many benefits that have nothing to do with weight loss. Number one, and very importantly, and they say this, physical activity is the ultimate stress buffer. And they point out, and it is true, well backed by science, that so many illnesses are the result of stress. And exercise can help alleviate the stress hormone in our body, which will lead to ultimate health, the prevention of many, many other illnesses, especially those that are, what do they call that? Inflammation related illnesses. So it says, regardless of the weight loss aspect of movement, it's a way of taking care of yourself. It increases your bone strength. It increases stress tolerance. It decreases blood pressure. It decreases risk for all kinds of chronic diseases, heart disease, diabetes, osteoporosis, on and on and on, heart and lung strength, all these things. So they give you really good information about getting rid of negative attitudes toward exercise. They talk about how critical it is, and I harp on this all the time, to get away from that no time to spare trap. And I love this because they use a term that I never heard. I thought I made this up, right? To make it a non-negotiable in your life. Because I have a list of non-negotiables, and they have a caption here, make movement a non-negotiable priority. And exercise is one of the non-negotiables in my life. Not as much for, my weight, but absolutely for my mental health, for how I feel, for how I engage in life, for my energy level, for my stress decretion. That's not a word. To decrease my stress, but it has to be a non-negotiable, and you have to carve the time out because it's so easy to not set aside time for that. And then they talk in the book about, do the stretching, do the strength training, do some of the cardio, make it, all over movement in all kinds of ways. And there are so many great ways to do this, and find something that you enjoy. And it doesn't have to be hardcore, boom, boom, boom. All right. The last principle of intuitive eating that's outlined in this book is honor your health with gentle nutrition. That's what they say. They say it's what you eat consistently over time that matters. Progress, not perfection. In other words, they're saying an occasional fast food meal isn't going to kill you. It's what you eat consistently. Post-ops, this absolutely applies to you, but maybe a little differently, because post-ops have an absolute blueprint, and it's critical that you follow this blueprint. And the blueprint is eating every 3 to 4 hours, 4 to 5 hours, whatever it is, whatever you've been taught. Maybe some programs say 3 meals a day, no snacks. Some say every 4 hours, no snacking in between. Do what you've been taught to do, but regardless if it's considered a meal or a snack, it's protein first. Protein first. We've talked about that ad nauseum. And again, if this is what you do consistently, it's not going to hurt you to have a piece of birthday cake, or a little cupcake every now and then, or a donut, or some lasagna, or some spaghetti, or a piece of pizza, or whatever it is that you love that's going to hit the spot. As long as the consistency is the protein first, the fruits and the vegetables, then the healthy starches and the healthy carbs, it's okay every now and then. Again, I'm going to go back to the caveat, unless you have an addiction or you have a specific food that triggers you. Then you've got to make your own decisions about that. And probably my biggest disagreement with this particular book is they don't believe in food addiction, and I adamantly do. You got to come to your own conclusions about that, and there are varying opinions about that, even within professional realms. I love this chapter because they do talk about some important factors that affect health and longevity. And they talk about this thing called the adverse childhood experiences. And I think I did an entire podcast about that. And if I didn't, I'm going to, because it absolutely impacts your relationship with food and the leading causes of death. And if you've experienced adverse childhood experiences, as noted in this profound research, you're more likely to have a very unhealthy relationship with food, wherein food is a primary source of comfort for a lot of people who have had adverse childhood experiences. If I haven't done a podcast episode, don't miss the one that I do on it. I'll check on that, and if I haven't done one, I'm going to do one. So that's important. They talk about that in this chapter, and they talk about a lot of really, really good things like food worry and how Americans are number one in worrying about food in the world. And they talk about, how we worry about food, and yet we have really unhealthy food habits in our country. And they talk about how Michael Phelps, who's the poster boy, they say the poster boy for the junk food diet, he had horrible eating habits when we consider what's healthy eating. So they talk about that, and they talk about the more a person focuses on a number, as in on the scale or in the grams or the calories or whatever, that it usually interferes with the process of listening to the body. And while I do agree with that, again, as a post-op who's gone through a surgical weight loss procedure, your dietitian who is trained in bariatric nutrition will give you some guidelines, and those are very important. So this may not completely align with the intuitive eating as promoted in this book, but you do want to get the information that is right for you wherever you're at in your journey. And they talk about how people who do eat healthy love it because it feels good, and that becomes the norm for them. And I will attest to that. I love to eat healthy food. I don't, I would much rather eat healthy food because I'm used to it. It feels good. I feel good about myself when I do it, when I eat healthy food. Yeah, I have junk food now and then for sure. But it's okay because that's not my norm. It's not my norm. And if you're a healthy bariatric post-op patient who's had a procedure, a surgical procedure, and you're following your protocol, it's not going to hurt you every now and then to deviate from it. But your healthy following of your bariatric protocol has to be the norm. So they have some food wisdom tenets in here that I think are important. Overall, I think this is a really good book with a lot of really good information about creating a healthy relationship with food and maintaining a healthy eating lifestyle. However, as a post-op, I'm not sure it's 100% in alignment with post-op eating, especially, and even if you're not a post-op, this especially is important. If you are an emotional eater or have a food addiction issue, if you have a lot of emotional issues tied up with your relationship with food, even if it's not emotional eating or addiction, but it's messages from other people or really unhealthy learned habits or things you were told about yourself in relationship to food, you've got to work through those first before intuitive eating will even be an option for you. But it's something worth knowing about and maybe working toward, especially if you haven't had a surgical weight loss procedure. If you have, then you definitely want to use what you've learned from your bariatric dietitian first and foremost, and then maybe incorporate intuitive eating as it works within those parameters. But those are the 10 principles of intuitive eating as outlined in the book. So, my take-home messages are, first of all, the book again is Intuitive Eating, a Revolutionary Anti-Diet Approach by Evelyn, Tribole, and Elyse, Resch, 4th edition. I will have the link to that on Amazon in the show notes. But what I want you to take home is a redundant message, what I just said. If you're a person who's had a surgical weight loss procedure, you stick to what your bariatric dietitian has told you as your process. First, foremost, and always. Make that the mainstay of how you eat, and then you are free to add foods that hit the spot at the end of your meal, or the things that are special occasion foods, not a problem if you're following the protocol of your bariatric dietitian. And for almost everyone who has been a chronic dieter or who has an unhealthy relationship with food, get some therapy. Honestly, these things are not second nature. It's not just, oh, well, of course that's what you do. It has to be learned, and you have to get help to work through a lot of things like emotional eating or understanding food addiction, learning to set boundaries for yourself, learning to speak up for yourself. Those things have to be learned with the help of a professional. So I urge you to do that on your own behalf. And again, thank you for listening to this podcast. Give me your ideas and your feedback about what you'd like to hear more of. And be sure to go to www.BariAftercare.com. It's BARI, aftercare, all one word, .com. And join our program. It's amazing. All right, friends, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Episode number 200, onward and forward. All right, see you next time.